4 men knelt on a wooden platform in a Swiss field, and the oldest rule in the Catholic Church was about to be broken in front of thousands of witnesses and a live stream camera. Not a rule about doctrine, not a rule about morals, the rule that sits underneath every other rule, the one that says a bishop cannot be made without the Pope's word. It is older than the printing press, older than the Reformation, older than most of the borders on a modern map. And on the 1st of July, 2026, in a tent outside a seminary in Écon, Switzerland, it was set aside on purpose in daylight, by men who believed they had no other choice. Every cardinal in Rome had been warned it was coming. None of them could stop it. And when it was over, the Pope, who had spent his first year preaching unity above all else, would have to decide exactly how far mercy could bend before it broke. This is where the story begins, but it does not start in 2026. It starts nearly 40 years earlier with an old French archbishop who believed the church he loved was dissolving in front of him, and a decision he made that still has not stopped echoing. In 1988, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre stood in that same town, Écon, and did the same thing the 4 men in the tent would do decades later. He consecrated bishops without the Pope's consent. Lefebvre had founded the Society of St. Pius XIII in 1970, a community of priests who rejected the reforms that followed the Second Vatican Council, the shift to Mass in local languages instead of Latin, the changes in how the Church related to other faiths, the entire modernising current that swept through Catholicism in the 1960s. For nearly 2 decades, Lefebvre negotiated with Rome, hoping for some accommodation that never fully arrived. By the late 1980s, convinced that the Church itself was in crisis and that his movement needed bishops of its own to survive him, he ordained 4 men without papal approval. The Vatican's response was immediate. Lefebvre and the 4 new bishops were excommunicated the same day. In the eyes of Rome, they had committed what canon law calls a schismatic act, a willful rupture from the unity of the Church. That should have been the end of the story, or at least the end of that chapter. It was not. The Society of St. Pius X did not fold. It grew. Seminaries opened. Parishes multiplied. Generations of young Catholics, many of whom had never lived through the council. The society was still fighting, found their way into its churches, drawn by the old Latin liturgy, the certainty, the sense of standing apart from a world, and sometimes a church, they felt had lost its way. By the time this story reaches 2026, the society counts 2 of its original bishops still living, more than 700 priests, over 260 seminarians, training across 5 seminaries, well over 100 brothers, dozens of oblates, and hundreds of religious sisters, representing 50 nationalities. It is not a fringe group anymore. It is, in the words of more than one Vatican analyst, something closer to a parallel church, pre-Vatican II in its instincts, global in its reach, and still, technically, outside the fold. To understand why this particular rule carries so much weight, it helps to step back from 2026 entirely and look at what the rule actually protects. From the earliest centuries of Christianity, the Church wrestled with a basic question: what makes a bishop, and not simply a man who has convinced other bishops to lay hands on him? Over time, through councils and centuries of accumulated practice, the answer settled into something close to what the Church still holds today. A valid consecration requires the proper rite, performed by a bishop who himself holds valid orders. But validity alone was never considered enough. The early Church also insisted on communion, that a new bishop be recognised and accepted by the wider body of bishops, united around the successor of Peter, so that the office itself remains a sign of unity rather than a tool any faction could use to multiply itself indefinitely. Strip away that second requirement, and in theory anyone with access to a validly ordained bishop could manufacture new bishops at will, each one answering to no one but the men who made him. The rule that a consecration needs papal consent is not, in that light, some invention of Vatican bureaucracy. It is one of the oldest safeguards the Church built to keep itself from splintering into 1,000 self-appointed hierarchies, each one claiming apostolic authority for itself. That is the rule the 4 men in that Swiss field set aside, not carelessly and not without genuine belief in what they were doing, but set aside all the same, in front of thousands of witnesses and a live stream that made sure the whole world would see it happen. For a while, it looked like the wound might close. Pope Benedict XVI, both as a cardinal and later as pope, spent years trying to bring the society back into full communion. In 2007, he loosened the restrictions on celebrating the Old Latin Mass across the entire Catholic world, a gesture aimed squarely at softening the ground between Rome and the traditionalists. 2 years later, in 2009, he went further still, lifting the excommunications on the 4 bishops Lefebvre had consecrated in 1988. It was meant to be an act of reconciliation. It became, instead, one of the most painful moments of Benedict's papacy. Days before the decree was made public, one of the 4 bishops, Richard Williamson, gave a television interview in which he denied that Jews had been murdered in gas chambers during the Second World War. The timing could not have been worse. What was intended as healing became a crisis with Jewish communities around the world, and Benedict later admitted that a simple search would have surfaced Williamson's views before the decree was ever signed. Williamson was eventually expelled from the society itself in 2012, cast out by the very group whose founder he had once helped install as bishop. But the damage to the reconciliation effort lingered, and full communion between Rome and the Society of St. Pius X never arrived. There is something almost instructive in how that earlier reconciliation collapsed, because it foreshadows so much of what would happen again in 2026. Benedict's gesture was an act of mercy extended without full knowledge of what it would surface. A reminder that when an institution as old and as global as the Catholic Church tries to heal a rupture, it is never negotiating with an idea. It is negotiating with actual men, carrying actual histories, some of them far darker than the theological disagreements that made headlines. The Society of St. Pius X that Leo inherited was not the same organisation Lefebvre founded in 1970, and it was not quite the same organisation Benedict tried to embrace in 2009 either. It had kept growing in the years between, largely outside the public eye, absorbing new priests and new families who had never lived through any of the earlier controversies, who knew the society only as the church down the road that still said Mass the old way. That is the community Pope Leo XIV would eventually be forced to formally declare outside communion, not a small circle of ageing ideologues clinging to a founder's grievance, but a living, multiplying body of ordinary Catholics who had built their entire religious lives inside its walls. That is the inheritance Pope Leo XIV walked into. An American pope, the first in history, elected in 2025, known for a governing style built on patience, on listening, on healing divisions, rather than forcing them into the open. Leo made unity the emphasis of his early pontificate. He allowed a prominent American cardinal to celebrate the Old Latin Mass inside St. Peter's Basilica, a small but pointed gesture toward Catholics, who still cherished the older liturgy. He spoke often of dialogue. He seemed, to many observers, like a pope determined to avoid confrontation wherever it could be avoided. And then the Society of St. Pius X told him it was going to consecrate 4 more bishops, with or without his blessing. The Society's Superior General, Father David Pagliarani, had been trying for months to secure an audience with Leo. It never happened. Pagliarani's justification, when the plan became public, rested on what he called a state of necessity. The Society's 2 surviving bishops from the original 1988 consecrations were old men now, unable to minister to a global community that had grown far beyond what 2 aging bishops could reasonably serve. Without new bishops, Pagliarani argued, the Society's priests could not be ordained. Its sacraments could not continue in the way its faithful depended on, and its future would wither along with its founders. To him and to those who followed him, this was not defiance for its own sake. It was survival, framed as a sacred duty to protect what he saw as the true faith from a church he believed had drifted into confusion. Rome did not see it that way, and it did not stay silent. On the 13th of May, the Vatican's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith issued a formal warning. Consecrations performed without the Pope's consent would constitute a schismatic act and would trigger automatic excommunication under canon law, not as a punishment handed down after some lengthy process, but as an immediate consequence, built into the law itself, for the bishops doing the consecrating and the men receiving it. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State, echoed the warning publicly, describing the planned ceremony in the same stark terms. The message from Rome could not have been clearer, and still the Society moved forward. As the date approached, the Society published what it called a profession of faith, sent directly to Pope Leo and to every cardinal in the Catholic Church. In it, the Society defended its traditionalist path as the only faithful response to what it identified as the great errors of the age: liberalism, modernism, and excess of ecumenical compromise. It was, in effect, a public case for schism, made in theological language, mailed to the very men who had the authority to stop it and chose, because they had no real power left to offer beyond words, to keep writing letters instead. And Leo did keep writing. On the 29th of June, with the consecrations just days away, he wrote directly to Pagliarani. It was not a bureaucratic notice. It was a personal appeal, an attempt to reach a man Leo could not get to sit across a table from him, urging him to abandon the plan, and warning, in plain terms, that dividing the Church was a grave sin. When that letter did not change course, Leo wrote again, even closer to the deadline, telling the Society that going ahead would strip its own followers of the licit, and in some cases even the valid, reception of the sacraments. It is worth sitting with that phrase for a moment, because it is not rhetorical. In Catholic theology, a sacrament performed by a bishop who has been excommunicated for a schismatic act exists in a genuine grey zone. Leo was not simply warning Pagliarani about his own soul. He was warning him about the souls of everyone who would kneel before those 4 new bishops in the years to come. The ordinary faithful who trusted the Society and who might never fully grasp what had shifted beneath their feet. Pagliarani did not turn back. And so the 1st of July arrived, and with it, the ceremony that had been building for months finally happened in the open, in front of the world. The Society did not treat the day quietly. It organised a 4-day live-streamed event around the consecrations, staged at its Swiss seminary, with the kind of production values that suggested an organisation fully aware of the cameras trained on it, and fully unashamed of what it was about to do. There was even a commemorative wine set offered to attendees who travelled to witness the ceremony in person, a strange, almost domestic detail, sitting alongside an act with such heavy theological weight. Nearly 4 decades after Lefebvre's original break with Rome, the Society was not shrinking from its outsider status. It was, by every visible sign, leaning into it, presenting the consecrations less as a reluctant last resort, and more as a statement of identity for a new generation of traditionalist Catholics who had grown up entirely inside the Society's world. On the day itself, under a tent erected outside the seminary, 4 men were consecrated bishops in the ancient rite, before thousands of faithful who had come from around the world to watch it happen. Their names were Marc Hanapier, Michel Poinsinet de Sivry, Michael Goldade, and Pascal Schreiber. Some had travelled from parishes thousands of miles from Switzerland, families packing children into cars and planes to witness a ceremony they had been told, by their own priests, was a matter of survival for the faith they had been raised in. They came prepared for celebration, not condemnation. Souvenir wine sets were sold to mark the occasion. Live-stream cameras were positioned to capture every gesture of the 4-day event, ensuring that a ceremony deliberately performed outside the Church's authority would nonetheless reach an audience the size of a church event, broadcast from Rome itself. The ceremony followed the same old Latin form the Society had preserved for decades, the same words, the same gestures, the same theology of apostolic succession that every valid episcopal consecration in the Catholic Church relies on. That is, in some ways, the cruelest irony sitting at the heart of this entire crisis. The rite itself was not broken. The men performing it believed sincerely that they were doing something holy. What was missing was not the sacred form. What was missing was the single word from Rome that, under the rule the Church has followed for centuries, transforms a valid ceremony into a licit one, into an act the Church itself recognises rather than condemns. Because that is the rule Pagliarani and his 4 new bishops broke. Not some minor administrative technicality invented to protect Vatican bureaucracy. A rule that reaches back through the entire structure of how the Catholic Church understands its own authority. That a bishop is not simply a spiritual office a man can claim for himself or receive from other bishops acting alone. He must receive it in communion with and under the authority of the successor of Peter. Break that rule, and under canon law the consequence is not a slow disciplinary process. It is automatic. The excommunication takes effect the moment the rite is completed, without a trial, without an appeal, built into the structure of the law itself the instant the ceremony crosses that line. For a few days after the 1st of July, the Vatican said little in public. Officials were absorbing what had happened, and perhaps hoping even then for some final gesture of reconciliation that never came. It did not take long for that hope to run out. On Thursday, the 2nd of July, the Vatican made it official. With Pope Leo's clear approval, the Church formally declared the Society of St. Pius X to be in schism, a formal rupture from the unity of the Catholic Church. The bishops and priests directly involved in the consecrations were excommunicated, and in a detail that carried its own quiet weight, the Vatican went further than simply addressing the clergy. It warned the Society's lay faithful, a global community that by the Society's own estimates may number close to 500,000 people, that they too now risked excommunication for continued participation in the schism. For attending the masses of bishops the Church no longer recognised as valid holders of that office. It is worth pausing here on exactly what kind of decision this was for Leo, because it did not fit the pattern he had spent his first year establishing. This was a pope who had built his early reputation on dialogue, on refusing to force confrontations, on trying to hold together a church, stretched between competing visions of what Catholic identity should look like in the 21st century. And now, barely more than a year into his pontificate, he had made a decision no pope had made in half a century, formally declaring a major traditionalist movement to be outside the Church's unity, with all the consequences that declaration carries for hundreds of thousands of ordinary believers who never consecrated anyone, who simply went to Mass on Sunday in a church they trusted. The reaction outside the Society's own world arrived quickly, and it arrived from directions that might have surprised anyone who assumed a schism declaration would only matter to canon lawyers and Vatican reporters. Catholic media outlets across the ideological spectrum treated the announcement as a defining moment of Leo's early papacy, precisely because it cut against the caricature that had started to form around him, the gentle, cautious American pope who preferred consensus to confrontation. Commentators who had spent a year describing Leo as a builder of bridges now had to reconcile that image with a pope who had just formally cast 500,000 believers outside the Church's visible unity. Some traditionalist-leaning Catholic commentators, sympathetic to the Society's grievances, even if they had never joined it themselves, described the declaration as heavy-handed, a missed opportunity for one more year of patient outreach. Others, further from that world, saw it as overdue. Proof that a governing style built on dialogue does not have to mean a governing style incapable of consequences. Both readings, in their own way, were responding to the same underlying tension. A pope who had spent a year being defined by his patience had just been defined, in a single week, by the limits of it. Andrew Chesnut, a professor of religious studies who has watched Vatican affairs closely for years, offered a reading of the moment that stuck with many Catholic observers. Leo's willingness to act decisively here, he suggested, showed that the Pope's emphasis on dialogue did not come at the cost of governing with authority when the moment demanded it. And while the decision would undoubtedly deepen the rift with the Society, Chesnut argued it might have the opposite effect among Catholics who remain inside the Church's structure, that watching the Pope draw a clear line, even reluctantly, even painfully, could actually strengthen the sense of shared belonging among Catholics, who otherwise disagree sharply about liturgy or pastoral direction. Unity, in other words, sometimes requires the willingness to say clearly who has stepped outside it. Father Robert Gall, an ethicist who has written on the Church's governance, framed the episode in similarly structural terms. The Society crisis, in his reading, crystallised something that had been true all along, but rarely tested this openly, that the Pope remains the centre around which the entire Church's unity is organised. A position Leo had increasingly stepped into during recent months, well beyond this single controversy. It is also worth remembering that Leo had already been quietly reshaping how the papacy relates to the College of Cardinals long before the Society crisis forced his hand. Early in his pontificate, he announced he wanted to meet with the full body of cardinals as a group of advisors on an annual basis, an unusual level of routine consultation for an office that has historically operated with enormous individual discretion. The first of these extraordinary consistories was convened in January of 2026, structured around linguistic groups, with a rapporteur reporting back from each. A second followed at the end of May, focused not on elevating new cardinals, but on the Church's mission itself, how to carry forward the vision of an earlier foundational document on evangelization, and how to keep the Church, in Leo's own words, living without complexes as a small flock bringing hope to the world, rather than retreating into a posture of institutional self-preservation. Seen against that pattern, the decision to formally declare the Society of St. Pius X in schism looks less like an aberration and more like the natural extension of a governing style, built on wide consultation, but sharp, decisive action once consultation had run its course. Because it is worth remembering that the Society of St. Pius X was not the only front on which Leo had been visibly asserting the weight of his office in the weeks before this crisis broke. In the spring, the American Pope had become an unexpected and increasingly vocal figure on the world stage, opposing the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and finding himself in an unusual public exchange with President Donald Trump. Trump posting his frustrations, Leo answering not through social media but through comments delivered in flight, while travelling in Africa. What had begun as a January address to the Holy See's diplomatic corps, in which Leo warned against nations using force to assert dominance in ways that undermine the post-war international order, had by early summer turned him into something like a global figurehead for the anti-war movement. a role few expected an American pope to occupy so quickly or so firmly. And there was more. In the same stretch of months, Leo had done something no pope before him had ever done, publicly acknowledging and apologising for the role church leaders in the 15th century played in authorising European powers to subjugate and enslave people they labelled infidels. He called it a wound in Christian memory, and asked pardon in the name of the Church, a statement that immediately opened difficult questions about whether apology alone could be enough, or whether some form of concrete repair might eventually be expected to follow it. Seen against that backdrop, the Society of St. Pius X crisis was not an isolated storm. It was the latest, and in some ways the most painful, entry in a run of decisions that had turned Leo's first 18 months into something far more consequential than the cautious, dialogue-first papacy many had expected when he was elected. A pope known for patience had in the space of a single season apologised for a 500-year-old sin, positioned himself against two of the world's most powerful nations at war, and formally cast a global movement of 500,000 Catholics outside the boundary of the church he leads. By the time July began its second week, Leo had left for his summer break at Castel Gandolfo, the historic papal retreat south of Rome, where he has made a habit of spending his days off playing tennis and swimming, a small human detail that sits oddly, almost tenderly, beside everything that preceded it. This year, though, he did not stay in the smaller villa he had used before. He moved into the apostolic palace overlooking the lake, appearing from its balcony to bless the townspeople gathered below in the piazza, a gesture so ordinary, so consistent with generations of popes before him, that it almost disguised how extraordinary the preceding weeks had actually been. The Vatican confirmed he would remain there until the 27th of the month, all public audiences suspended, the first real pause he had allowed himself since the crisis began. There is something worth noticing in that image. A pope who had just formally severed communion with 500,000 people standing on a balcony, blessing a town square full of ordinary residents who had nothing to do with any of it, offering the same gesture popes have offered from that same spot for generations. The papacy does not pause for its own crises. It keeps blessing, keeps greeting, keeps showing up on balconies, because the office was never built around a single controversy, however painful. It was built to outlast them. Lefebvre's schism has now outlasted 4 popes. Whatever Leo decided in the first week of July will likely outlast him too, inherited by whoever eventually sits in that same apartment overlooking 2 states, facing whatever version of this same argument the society or its successors chooses to raise a generation from now. Consider, for a moment, what the declaration actually means for someone who is not a bishop, not a priest, not any kind of public figure at all, a mother in Ohio, say, or a retired teacher in Argentina, or a young father in the Philippines, who has spent years driving past 3 closer parishes to reach the society chapel, because it was the only place within 100 miles that still offered the Mass, in the form he grew up believing was the fullest expression of his faith. That person did not consecrate anyone. That person did not sign any profession of faith, did not appear on any live stream, did not make any public statement about Rome's authority at all. They simply went to church, the way their parents had, the way they intended to raise their own children to do. And now, with a single formal declaration issued from the Vatican, they find themselves standing on the far side of a line they never chose to cross, told that continued attendance at the only Mass they trust now carries the risk of the same automatic excommunication that fell on the bishops themselves. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the headlines, because headlines are built for consecrations and canon law, not for the quieter arithmetic of 500,000 ordinary lives suddenly recalculated by a single Thursday announcement. Some of those families will leave the society, reluctantly or with relief, and try to find their way back into a diocese that may not fully understand where they have been. Others will stay exactly where they are, telling themselves that the Mass has not changed even if their relationship with Rome has, that the sacraments they receive still carry whatever grace they always carried, regardless of what a decree in Rome now calls their status. Still others will simply stop thinking about it in those terms at all, choosing loyalty to their local priest and their local community over a theological argument about apostolic succession that feels, from the pew, almost impossibly abstract. None of those responses is simple. None of them is without cost. A schism declared in Rome does not stay in Rome. It travels quietly into kitchens and car rides home from Mass, and conversations between grandparents and grandchildren about what it means to belong to a church that has just told an entire community it no longer fully belongs. It is worth asking, too, what this means for the 4 men who knelt in that tent, believing they were saving something rather than breaking it. Marc Hanapierre, Michel Poinsinet de Sivry, Michael Goldade, and Pascal Schreiber did not wake up on the 1st of July intending to become symbols of rupture. In the Society's own account of events, they understood themselves as answering a genuine crisis of continuity. Two elderly bishops, a global community depending on a functioning hierarchy, and a Vatican that would not grant the audience Pagliarani had spent months requesting. Whatever judgment history eventually renders on that reasoning, it is worth remembering that from inside the Society's own theological framework, this was not chosen as an act of rebellion for its own sake. It was chosen as the lesser of two feared outcomes: schism now, deliberately, on their own terms, or a slow institutional collapse later, once the last of the 1988 bishops could no longer serve. Rome, of course, does not recognise that framing, and canon law does not make allowances for sincerity of motive when the act itself meets the definition of schism. But understanding why men convince themselves that breaking the oldest rule in their church is the only way to save it may be the only real path toward eventually healing what that decision has now broken. What happens next to the Society of St. Pius X is, in truth, still unwritten. Reconciliation has happened before, however imperfectly. Benedict's efforts in 2007 and 2009 prove that even the deepest ruptures in the Church's modern history have not always stayed permanent. But those efforts also proved something else: that healing a schism this old, this institutionalized, this deeply woven into the identity of the people inside it is not the work of a single letter, a single gesture, or a single pope. It took the Society 50 years to grow into what it is today. Whatever repair might eventually come, if it comes at all, will likely take patience, measured on a similar scale. For now, what remains is the image from that tent in Acorn. 4 men kneeling to receive an office the Church itself will not recognise, believing sincerely that they were saving something, while in Rome a pope who had spent a year preaching unity found himself forced to draw the oldest line the Church has, the line that decides who stands inside communion with Peter's successor, and who, however unwillingly, has stepped outside it. Leo did not want this fight. Every letter he wrote in the weeks before the consecrations makes that plain. But when persuasion failed, he did not hesitate to use the authority his office carries, even knowing the cost would fall not only on the men who knelt in that field, but on the 500,000 ordinary believers who now find themselves on the far side of a line most of them never chose to cross. There is a broader question sitting underneath this entire crisis, one that reaches well beyond the Society of St. Pius X and touches nearly every tension inside modern Catholicism. What does unity actually require? Is it enough for a church to hold together institutionally, with a single visible head and a single canon law, even while its members disagree sharply about liturgy, about language, about how far the Second Vatican Council's reforms should reach into daily worship? Or does real unity demand something harder? A genuine, felt communion, not merely an administrative one, between believers who may never fully agree on what their own church should look like. Leo's entire first year suggests he believes the answer lies somewhere in the difficult middle, that unity is worth enormous patience, worth letter after letter to a man who would not answer his calls, worth allowing the old Latin Mass back into St. Peter's Basilica as a gesture of goodwill toward the very community that would go on to defy him weeks later. But his decision on the 2nd of July also suggests he believes unity has a floor beneath which patience can no longer reach, that a church cannot indefinitely tolerate a movement, consecrating its own bishops outside the structure that holds everyone else together, no matter how sincerely that movement believes it is acting to preserve the faith rather than fracture it. That tension will not resolve itself quickly, and it may never fully resolve at all. The church Leo leads is, in its own way, still living inside the argument. The Second Vatican Council opened more than 60 years ago, an argument about how much continuity with the past a living tradition can sacrifice in the name of engaging a changing world, and how much change a living tradition can absorb before it stops being recognisably itself. The Society of St. Pius X answered that argument by refusing, from the very beginning, to accept the terms of the debate at all. Leo, by contrast, has spent his pontificate trying to hold every side of that argument inside one church at once, reaffirming the Council's teaching as the guiding star of the Church's path forward, even while making room, wherever he reasonably could, for those who still long for what came before it. The events of this July did not end that balancing act. They simply revealed, with unusual clarity, exactly how much weight it can bear before something has to give. That, in the end, is the quiet tragedy sitting underneath the drama of broken rules and formal declarations. It was never really about 4 bishops. It was about the families in society parishes across the world who will wake up this Sunday, walk into the same church they have gone to for years, and have to reckon with what it now means to sit in those pews. The oldest rule in the Church was broken to protect a community's future, and in breaking it, that same community was placed outside the very unity its founder once fought so hard, in his own way, to defend. Whether that wound closes in Leo's lifetime, or lingers the way Lefebvre's first schism has lingered for 38 years and counting, is a question no letter, no decree, and no consecration has yet been able to answer.